prepared to enforce free speech? Is my right honourable friend prepared to legislate to ensure that they do?
Secretary of State.
For many of us, we take free speech as an absolute given, and we expect it to be an absolute given in every part of this country. And if legislation is required, that is what we will do. But, Mr. Speaker, it isn't just at universities that you sometimes see a challenge to free speech. Members on this side of the House understand the importance of free speech, whether that is in universities or whether that is in the free press, and that is why members on this side of the House will always be the ones who stand up for the free press and make sure people are able to enjoy their newspapers every single day.
Minister Donald, substantive question from Miranda Sharma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with permission, I will answer questions 2, 3 and 4 together. We are working across government and closely with the higher education sector, utilising the HE task force, which I created to ensure that the vast majority of students who want to go to university this year can do so at the university their grades unlock.
Let's head to Miranda Sharma in Ealing. Miranda Sharma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Universities need financial support to not only expand physical buildings and facilities, but also to fund an expansion of well-being and support services and other important areas of university life. Can the Secretary of State confirm this additional support will be granted to ensure his algorithm has not cost thousands of students their futures? And when will he do this?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, in fact, we announced a £10 million capital fund to cover capital as well as equipment. This is on top of our announcement for additional funding to support high-cost subjects and is all on top of the announcements that we made in both May for the sustainability of the sector and supported by the base package of £280 million.
Tamnanjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In a recent National Union of Students survey, 55% of students report that the income of their parents or those who provide financial support to them has been negatively impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, and 80% are worried about how they will cope financially, not to mention that part-time jobs will be in short supply. So given that the university hardship funds were not designed for such demand, what extra provision will the government make to ensure that universities are able to properly support students facing hardship?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If a student is not already accessing the maximum loan and their parental or carer's income has changed, they should fill in a change of income form under the student loan company. And further to the Honourable Member's question, in regards to hardship funds, we have worked with the OFS so that they can show more flexibility, and that will be £256 million for the coming academic year.
Holly Mumbycroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Hannah Moat is one of the top high jump athletes in the UK and was on track to study psychology and criminology at Loughborough University. Unfortunately, due to a clerical error inputting her centre-assessed grade, she's so far been denied her place on that course. Will the Minister work with me to ensure that students like Hannah, who have been affected by administrative errors made by their schools, will not be denied their place at university?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm really sorry about the problems that Hannah is experiencing. The DAM boards have committed to turning around appeals quickly, and Hannah and her school should inform the university of the situation. I have agreed with all universities that all students, including those successful in appeal, with the required grades, will be offered a place at their first choice university, and deferred places will only be offered as a last resort. Specific admissions cases are the responsibility of individual institutions, but I will alert Loughborough to this case.
Shadow Minister Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share SAGE's serious concerns that the annual mass migration of millions of students to any university means that, quote, significant outbreaks of COVID-19 are highly likely. Universities have worked hard to make campuses COVID secure, but the Department for Education must take responsibility and ownership of this crisis and recognise that most students live, work and socialise outside of the campuses. When will universities and communities receive the updated guidance on safe reopening promised in a DfE press release late on Friday night? What additional testing capacity is being deployed to keep staff, students and communities safe? And will the Minister make a statement this week on the safe reopening of universities?
Minister Donnan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. SAGE did indeed publish their updated guidance on Friday, and the government will issue updated guidance this week, which supplements our original guidance months ago. The safety and well-being of university staff and students is always our priority. And as SAGE pointed out, there is also evidence that physical and mental health will be impacted if universities do not open. Universities have worked hard to ensure that they're well prepared for COVID and have prioritised the safety and well-being, including introducing numerous social distancing and COVID secure measures.
Alison McGovern.
Number 6, please, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Return to school is an important opportunity to support pupils to increase their physical activity. The Department's guidance includes information on how schools can provide PE and opportunities for pupils to be active, including links to detailed advice from the subject organisations.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that's a disappointing answer because we know going into this crisis, councils were already having to deal with the fact that they'd had £42 million cut from their sports budget, which has a knock-on impact on schools. So will the Secretary of State take this opportunity to put on record what he personally is going to do to increase funding support to make sure our kids are physically active at school?
Well, it was a Conservative government that's introduced the sports premium. It was a Conservative government that's ensuring that £320 million is going out to schools so they can ensure that youngsters have the kind of activity that they want to see. Returning to school, yes, it's incredibly important in terms of a learning that all children benefit from, but it's also about the physical health that they'll get for being back at school, that we're backing with that money and ensuring there's great sports activities in all schools right across the country.
Question 7, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Gibb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Exams will be available in all GCSE, AS and A-level subjects in the autumn. Schools and colleges that accepted entries from private candidates, including home-educated students in the summer, should enter those who wish to sit an exam, and there should be no financial barriers to doing so.
I thank the Minister for his reply, but I wanted to raise with him the issue of my constituent Ella Hampson, who's a Year 10 student, home educated, due to take several GCSEs a year early. The decision to withdraw private candidates meant that, unlike her friends and her peers, she wasn't given estimated grades on GCSE day. That caused a delay. She hasn't been able to move on to college in a way that she had hoped. And in any event, she's been told by her exam centre that she will need to be 16 on the 31st of August, and so she's not eligible for the autumn examination. She's only 15. I wonder what advice the Minister can give Ella for her to get the grades to recognise the work she's done this year.
Minister Gibb.
Well, private candidates who were entered for the summer series, or where the school intended to enter them for summer, are eligible to enter the autumn series. The candidate's age is actually not relevant. We expect the school or college that enters students for the summer series to enter them for the autumn.
Chair of the Select Committee, Robert Holford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many thousands of private candidates, including mature students and those undertaking resets, have been left without a grade under this year's exams arrangements, unable to progress to the next stage of their educational employment. So will the Minister ensure that UCAS predicted grades are confirmed for all external candidates, provide them, just to confirm, the option to sit autumn exams free of charge, ensure the highest grade of the UCAS result and autumn resit be awarded, and urge universities to honour their offers for a September 2021 start date end, and for those external candidates who've received a centre assessed grade, allow them to appeal their results?
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend raises some important points. Of course, as my honourable friend said earlier, universities are being flexible in terms of entry to universities this year. Schools, colleges and FE colleges are able to provide additional support to students sitting their exams in the autumn if they have the capacity to do so. And schools can also now use their pupil premium funding to support these pupils. The autumn exams, Mr. Speaker, are an important backstop to the summer grade process, and we are helping schools to offer them to students by assisting with additional space and invigilators where required.
Jill Furness.
Question number 9, Mr Speaker.
Minister Keegan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Colleges are facing financial uncertainty as a result of COVID-19, and many face reductions in commercial income and uncertainty with apprenticeship starts. We have a team, including skilled finance professionals, who are working very closely to support colleges, and we're also working with banks to ensure access to commercial lending where required. Since April, only 5 colleges have needed to access emergency funding.
Mr Speaker, further education colleges provide lifelong learning, and they will be essential if we are to provide the levelling up agenda which the Prime Minister speaks so fondly of. However, coronavirus has left many with a black hole in their funding, and we understand it could be as much as £2 billion, and at the moment we are facing unprecedented demand. I just fear that this government does not understand the value of further education, or the value it is to the economy and to the new skills that we require in this country going forward. And also, FE colleges are flexible, they are adaptable, and they can help many young people who have been let down by this government during the fiasco of the education GCSE results and A-level results. Will the Minister confirm today that she will look into this and that she will actually provide the necessary funding, which, according to the Sixth Form Colleges Association, should be £4,760 per year for 16, 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds? Thank you.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Let me assure her that we absolutely have FE colleges at the very heart and centre. We're planning a big reform of the sector, and as somebody who went to FE college myself from the age of 16, I'm absolutely passionate about this area. The colleges have done an amazing job responding to COVID-19 to support students throughout coronavirus. We continue to pay the grant funding and monthly payments for 2019 and 20, and will do so for 2020-21. We've also provided catch-up funding of 96 million for small group tutoring for those disadvantaged students that need them. On top of that, allocated of 200 million for FE colleges to be able to improve their buildings. We have a team of officials right now working with colleges, every college that needs that support. We are working with 40, but so far only 5 have needed financial assistance, but we will keep this under review.
Minister Toby Peckins.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The government's own Commissioner for Further Education warned that as many as 40 colleges are currently at risk of running out of cash. Despite the measures that the Minister's just spoken of, the Association of Colleges are warning of a £2 billion cash shortfall, and we know from the Ney report that the government has got inadequate mechanisms for identifying colleges in crisis. So the truth is that all of those measures that the Minister speaks about simply aren't enough, and we need far greater action if we're going to see our colleges, their pupils and their staff not let down and left in financial crisis this autumn.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. Just so we're clear, we have actually provided grant funding to the FE sector worth over £3 billion for a full year, and they very gratefully received that. We've also increased and announced an increase of funding of 400 million for 2020-2021, an increase of 7% in overall funding. As you rightly said, and I said, I think, to the answer to the earlier question, we have 40 colleges which we're working with to structure their finances and help get them the advice and support they need. And if they need emergency funding, as has been available, then it will be available to those as well. We have a team of people working on this all the time, and the colleges accept that we are there with putting our arms around them to make sure that they get through this period.
Substantive question to Minister Gibb.
Oh, thought I was going to read it out. Exams are the best and fairest way of judging students' performance. Following the difficulties experienced with awarding grades this summer, we are determined that exams should go ahead next year. We are working with Ofqual, the exam boards and other stakeholders to consider our approach to ensure they are fair.
Heading to Bury Sherman. Bury Sherman.
Mr Speaker, the Minister is the one permanent feature in the Department of Education. He's been there for 10 years. But surely he must admit that so many families and so many students were hurt by the chaos and the instability in his department. And it's no good trying to blame Ofqual or Ofsted. The responsibility lies in instability and lack of firm leadership in his department. And what is he going to do about it?
Well, when we were aware of the problems with the A-level results, we took swift action. The Ofqual decided to move to centre assessment grades, and within 48 hours of that decision being taken, the recalculated A-level grades were sent to all schools, and the GCSE results on the new basis were also given to schools to enable them to give to their students on the day scheduled, which was August the 20th. The model that was used to ensure that we were able to give students qualifications, notwithstanding the fact that we had to cancel exams because of the pandemic, was supported in a wide-ranging consultation by the regulator. It was supported by 89% of respondents, and it was a similar model was used in all 4 nations of the United Kingdom.
Shadow Secretary of State Kate Green.
The fiasco surrounding last month's exam results caused huge distress to students, to their parents and teachers, and chaos for universities and colleges. And now it turns out that the Secretary of State was repeatedly warned of the dangers of the system of calculated grades and a flawed standardisation methodology that he adopted. He was warned by a former senior official of the department, he was warned by the regulator, and he was warned by what happened in Scotland. Why did he ignore those warnings?
Those warnings were not ignored. Every time we heard from people like Cambridge Assessment and John Coles and others, we raised these issues with Ofqual. And all those various challenges that were made by individuals were raised with Ofqual. We were assured by the regulator that overall the model was fair. We pressed Ofqual strongly on the appeals arrangements, which would address any issues for individual students which arose as a result of the operation of their model. No model is as accurate as young people taking the exams themselves. But when the A-level results were published on the 13th of August, it did become clear that there were anomalies and injustices in the results that went beyond the anomalies that we had been made aware of, for which we had put in place an enhanced appeal process. And as I said earlier, swift action was taken to ensure that all young people got the just and fair results they deserve.
Simon Bolton.
Mr. Speaker, the Centre for Ageing... Question 13 indeed, Mr. Speaker.
Here you go.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We understand that ensuring adults can access the training they need is vitally important and is more important than ever. Latest figures show that between August 2019 and April 2020, over 195,000 learners out of a total of 1,624,000 FE learners over 19 benefited from support for the unemployed. We are supporting people by investing £1.34 billion in 2020 and 21 in adult education, and we're investing £2.5 billion over the course of the Parliament in the National Skills Fund.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for her response. The Centre for Ageing Better have highlighted how the number of older workers on unemployment-related benefits more than doubled to over 600,000 in July. But she will also know the core adult education budget is still frozen in cash terms with last year's amount, and those who are recently unemployed or redundant who want to access training or retraining to upskill often cannot afford it or risk losing universal credit if they do so. The Minister, I am sure, will not want this to be summing up the government's approach to lifelong learning. So will she meet with me, Ruskin College and West Thames College to hear about the issues that we are facing in Hounslow, an aviation community, and to give people hope so that they too can have the opportunity to move forward ahead and get back into work?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady. Of course, we're absolutely committed to helping everybody who may find themselves looking for a job through this period, through no fault of their own, access to training of any age at any stage. That's why the Chancellor set out his plan for jobs to give businesses confidence to retain and hire and get careers back on track. And that includes £1.6 billion to scale up employment training, support and apprenticeships. We're investing in high quality careers provision, incentivising employers to hire new apprentices, tripling the number of sector-based work academy placements and doubling the number of work coaches. This is on top of we're also investing 2.5 billion, which will be available in April 2021, and I'm sure that the colleges will be very much looking forward to that. And we're working to make sure that will make sure everyone has access to training. And of course, I'm very happy to meet colleges, and I'll be very happy to do so with the Honourable Lady.
14, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government will fund local authorities for our free childcare entitlements for the rest of this calendar year at the pre-COVID levels of attendance, even if fewer children are present. So early year providers will continue to benefit from the 3.6 billion investment in the provision this financial year. We've also announced supplementary funding of up to £23 million for maintained nursery schools, who often care for higher numbers of disadvantaged pupils, and will continue to work with the local authorities to monitor the sector.
Thank you, Minister, for that answer. But last week, research was published by the TUC showing that 4 out of 10 working mothers either did not have or could not rely upon childcare to enable them to return to work. And of those, a quarter could not rely upon having a nursery place. Now, given that there is already a £660 million gap in early years funding, what is the Minister doing to make sure that we do not see a further loss of early years providers in the coming months?
Mr. Ford.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Childcare is vital for working parents, which is why this government introduced the 30 hours entitlements and why we're investing 3.6 billion in early years this year. Breakfast and after-school clubs are also able to open, and schools should be working to resume this provision from the start of this term. And we've updated our guidance for providers. Any parent that is maybe struggling to find an early year provision should contact their local authority. But I hope the Honourable Lady will join me in welcoming the funding for the maintained nursery schools, including the 3 in her own constituency.
We now come to Jill Morrow.
Thank you. Question 15.
Minister again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ministers and officials have been in regular contact with representatives of schools and academy trusts on all aspects of the government's COVID response, including on financial issues. Schools have been able to claim funds to meet certain additional costs, and we are providing £1 billion in catch-up funding.
Jill Morrow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Schools in Newcastle went back this week, and teachers have spent the summer working incredibly hard to make them COVID secure whilst dealing with the exams debacle. Sacred Heart in my constituency tell me that they've had to alter the classrooms, they've bought visors and face masks and sanitizers, they've had to increase cleaning rotas and produce online videos, guidance for every year group at a cost of tens of thousands of pounds following years of budget cuts. So the Minister can't give them their summer back, but he can give them their money back. Will he do so?
Minister.
Well, I join the Honourable Lady in paying tribute to head teachers, other staff up and down the country who have worked tirelessly to get their schools ready for welcoming back students in a safe way from this September. Schools have been able to claim for unavoidable costs incurred between March and July due to the pandemic that can't be met from the school's existing resources, up to £75,000 depending on the size of the school. Core schools funding this year has risen by an additional £2.6 billion, and that's part of a 3-year settlement, which is the biggest funding boost in a decade. And although, of course, we keep these issues under review, our priority for additional funding has been to put the maximum possible into catch-up funding, some £1 billion, to schools to enable them to help young people to catch up from their lost education.
Shadow Minister Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's response to my honourable friend, the member for Newcastle Central, is disappointing. It's extraordinary that back in July, the Schools Minister told me that the Government does not consider it necessary for schools to make significant adaptations to their sites to enable them to welcome children back to school this autumn. That is not what head teachers are saying. They have told me that they are very concerned about the extra costs that schools are facing in relation to COVID-19 for hand sanitizer, signage, barriers, cleaning, and the support and teaching staff that they may need to cover COVID-related absences. So what steps will the government take to ensure that all schools can be reimbursed for COVID-related costs, and what would he say to those head teachers who are now openly saying that they are having to weigh up pupil safety against financial stability?
Minister Grant.
Well, we have, as I said, announced a 3-year generous settlement for schools. It's the best funding settlement in 10 years, over £14.4 billion over those 3 years. But those schools that are in financial difficulties, they can approach their local authority, they can approach the Educational Skills Funding Agency, who will, of course, provide supports for schools that are experiencing difficulties, including the deployment of school resource management advisors. Schools and academies do have an overall £4 billion worth of cumulative reserves, and we expect those to be used first. But we do keep this issue under review, and our regional teams are constantly monitoring whether schools are struggling to provide the hygiene and all the other measures that schools are putting in place right across the country.
Matt Weston.
Question number 17, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 17, 18 and 19 together. We're continuing to do everything in our power to ensure all children and staff can be back in the classroom safely. Our guidance is clear that if schools implement the actions set out in our system of controls in our guidance, they'll effectively reduce risks in their schools and create an inherently safer environment for all to operate in.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to place on record my thanks to across the country to the professionalism and the efforts really of all our teachers, all our senior leadership teams who've done such an amazing job over the weeks, and I'm sure that's echoed across the chamber. However, just in the last week, a few days of the start of term, we've had 46 cases in schools across the UK. In Scotland, there were 86 cases. A total of 158 schools already have cases. In a Suffolk school, 5 teachers, I think it's in the Health Secretary's own constituency, 5 teachers, and the school has had to close. Does the Minister, or the Secretary of State rather, is he confident the government really has this under control?
Secretary of State.
Very much so. And if I draw the Honourable Gentleman's attention to the joint letter by the Chief Medical Officers of England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, what they were pointing out is that the children are best served by being in school. But the Honourable Gentleman is right to highlight the risks and sort of some of the challenges of children returning to school. And this is why at every stage, working right across the sector, we've put in place the strictest level of controls and system of controls in order to create that safe environment, not just for the children, not just for those who work in schools, but for the community as a whole.
Tammy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week marked the long-awaited return to schools for many students and young people across Coventry North West. However, this was a time marked with anxiety for parents, students and teachers about what would school look like during the pandemic. I've had a number of constituents contact me about being cramped into small spaces and a lack of support for students with pre-existing medical conditions, which put them at a greater risk of contracting and responding badly to the coronavirus. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Secretary of State is, what allowances or provisions has the government provided to schools to keep students with pre-existing medical conditions safe? And will the government stop passing the buck to schools and make face coverings compulsory in communal areas and secondary schools?
Secretary of State.
Well, as every stage, when we saw over 1.6 million children returning to school before the summer holidays, as we see the full return after the summer holidays, every precautionary measure that can be taken is taken in order to ensure that children of all ages and those who do suffer disabilities, their needs are properly catered for. And if there's specific issues that the Honourable Lady has, please do feel free to write to me and I'd be happy to look at those in detail.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Getting our children back to school is critically important. It's vital that there's not just the safety at school, but also safety and capacity within school transport. I know from talking to local family coach operators like J&C Coaches based in Newton Aycliffe that the environment for coach operators is particularly challenging now. Whilst the postponement of the implementation of the PSVR regulations for school transport provides some relief, this is still a sword hanging over coach operators and their future viability. For longer time viable opposition cannot be signposted. This could result in them withdrawing from the market, reducing capacity, when it's precisely what the opposite is needed. The current approach drives excessive costs to both coach operators and by extension local authorities. Whilst I absolutely endorse the need for accessible transport, can his department work to make these more fit for purpose for school transport?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for raising this important issue and highlighting the concerns of his constituents and coach operators in his constituency. Dealing with the issue of children getting to school as schools fully return has been an important one. That is why the Department for Transport made over £10 million available to build capacity in local authorities. That's why we made over £40 million available to local authorities to put on extra transport. But the issue that my honourable friend raises is one that has been concerned to many constituency MPs, and I know as a Member of Parliament in Staffordshire, one that we also highlighted with the Department for Transport. I think is a positive move that the DFT made in terms of delaying the implementation of these regulations, but I will ask a Minister within the Department for Transport to meet with my honourable friend to discuss this further.
Bill Lesterson.
Question 20.
Secretary of State.
In local areas where restrictions have been implemented, we anticipate that schools will usually remain fully open to all. There may be exceptional circumstances in which some level of restriction to education or childcare is required in a local area. In those situations, local and national partners will carefully consider the most appropriate actions with the aim of retaining as much face-to-face education as possible.
Bill Lesterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I presume when the Secretary of State says open to all, he doesn't mean people who've tested positive for COVID in his description there. There is a great deal of confusion amongst children, amongst parents and amongst our wonderful school staff about what the arrangements are in the event of a local lockdown or an isolated outbreak. The confusion, of course, extends to what the arrangements are for home learning. So can the Secretary of State please tell us where is the guarantee that all children who have to study from home have access to broadband? Where is the guarantee that all staff will have the capacity to deliver home learning? And can you tell us what happened to the laptops that were promised months ago to enable this to happen?
State.
Well, the honourable gentleman was probably aware that we distributed over 200,000 laptops as well as over 40,000 internet router connections for children from the most disadvantaged communities, and those went to local authorities and multi-academy trusts. So the honourable gentleman says they never arrived, and I would suggest that he takes it up with his own local authority where they were sent directly to. But Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman does raise an important point about the continuity of education. That's why on the 2nd of July we outlined our expectations and what is required of schools in terms of delivery of continuity of education. That's why we've made an investment of a further 150,000 laptops that will be provided for those communities that are in a position where they're not going to be able to be providing face-to-face teaching within schools. But to be absolutely clear, schools will only ever be closed as an absolute last resort, because we all understand in this House, on both sides of this House, how important it is for children to be benefiting from being in school with their teachers and learning in the school environment.
Secretary of State with substantive questions, Scott Benton.
I will answer questions 21 and 22 together. In addition to the pupil premium, the £350 million national tutoring programme will provide affordable, high-quality tuition to disadvantaged pupils in schools and colleges. The catch-up premium provides a further £650 million to schools, make up for the lost teaching time of all pupils.
We go to Blackpool with Scott Benton. Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will be aware of the recent data which highlighted the learning gap between rich and poor secondary age pupils, and which demonstrated that the disparity was wider in Blackpool than in any other part of the country. I know that the government are determined to close this gap, so will my right honourable friend join me in calling for additional resources to those schools in opportunity areas such as Blackpool, which have particularly acute challenges?
Well, it was a great pleasure to be able to join my honourable friend to visit St George's Academy in his constituency of Blackpool South and see the amazing work that has been done there in terms of raising educational attainment in his constituency. And he's right to highlight the important role that opportunity areas can play. That's why we've already invested £6 million in the Blackpool opportunity area, and that's why it's a pleasure to announce just a short time ago the fact that we're investing almost another £2 million in Blackpool, in the opportunity area, on top of all the extra investment that we're making in terms of schools and the COVID catch-up fund as well.
Would the Secretary of State agree that key to tackling this issue is to start early? Would he commend the role of nursery schools in that provision? And can he find a way to give them a long-term sustainable funding settlement so they can plan for the future?
I think my honourable friend's tempting me into sort of a discussion that I probably have to have first with the Chancellor prior to having it with him. But he is absolutely right to highlight the important role that early action and early support in children's lives plays. And that's why I was very, very much delighted to see that we are going to be taking the action to invest in the Nuffield early language interventions that have already shown that they can deliver so much for youngsters, and building on that into the future is an important part of the work that the department is doing with our schools and so much more.
Andrew Jones.
Question 23, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
I will answer questions 23 and 24 together. The government has announced a catch-up package worth £1 billion, including a catch-up premium worth a total of £650 million to support schools to make up for lost teaching time. This is an addition to the National Tutoring Programme that is aimed and targeted at those children who are most disadvantaged in all of our constituencies.
I thank my right honourable friend for that answer. There's been a huge variation in the amount of school missed, often caused by the amount of online learning available and the capacity to access it. The amount of catch-up needed is therefore individual and diverse, and that's challenging for both families and teachers. So how is my right honourable friend supporting schools in their assessment of that individual need and their response to it?
Well, I would very much like to point to the work of the Education Endowment Foundation that we issued with our guidance, and the evidence-based work that they have undertaken to make sure that schools, while they'll make the assessment of the individual needs of those children and what help and intervention can be sort of put in place for them, there's clear guidance of what works in the classroom environment. That might mean extending the school day for some, that might mean Saturday classes for others. There are so many different interventions that can really deliver significant results in terms of helping youngsters catch up on the learning that they have lost.
Chris Skidmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My local authority, South Gloucestershire Council, was the first in the country to implement a recovery curriculum to support schools, working with experts from a range of fields and also taking in international examples to get children back into the classroom. Will the Secretary of State join with me in congratulating South Gloucestershire Council and all the teachers on their hard work to provide vital support for local pupils, but also to encourage his department and other local authorities to consider this model as potential best practice?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'd very much like to join with my right honourable friend in congratulating South Gloucestershire Council on the work that they have been doing and rolling out across schools in their area. And I would be absolutely delighted to look at that work and maybe meet up with my right honourable friend and colleagues from South Gloucestershire Council to understand some of the work that's been undertaken and what we can use from that to roll out in different parts of the country.
Rob Butler.
Number 25, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Ford.
Thank you. The pandemic has been challenging for all families, but it's been particularly challenging for children with special educational needs and disabilities and their families. We've published a range of guidance to support children, families, carers and educational settings, and I wrote an open letter to all children and those who support them last week. We're increasing the high needs funding by 730 billion next year, on top of this year's 780 billion, which is an increase of nearly a quarter over the 2 years, and providing additional catch-up support on top of that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Special schools for physically disabled children, such as the superb PACE Centre in my constituency of Aylesbury, have faced special challenges over the past few months. How will my honourable friend ensure that as term gets underway, they receive advice and support that is tailored to the specific physical needs and circumstances of their pupils and the wider circumstances of their families, so that all children, whether they're disabled or non-disabled, can benefit from a full and varied education? Minister.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for this question, and I'd like to thank all the staff at PACE and special schools across the country for all that they do. We've worked with the sector to provide detailed guidance, which we continually update as needed and will continue to do so going forward. Those who need tailored support will be glad to hear that specialists, therapists, clinicians and other support staff can attend school sites and provide those interventions as usual. And in terms of our £1 billion of catch-up funding, there will be 3 times more going into special schools than into mainstream schools.
Substantive question, Tulip Sadiq, Minister Ford.
Mr. Speaker, many children with special...
Sorry, the Minister should have answered. I've asked the question on behalf of the Minister, and then we'll come back to the question. You read out your answer.
Is this the same question, Mr. Speaker? It's a supplementary question. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Sorry, Tulip Sadiq.
Mr. Speaker, many children with special educational needs and disabilities will find a return to school after a prolonged period of absence extremely challenging. The Children's Commissioner for England has warned that government guidance on school exclusions could encourage a zero-tolerance approach to challenging behaviour that may result in children with SEND who are struggling to readjust being excluded in large numbers. Can the Minister reassure me that she won't allow this to happen? And will she commit to reporting to the House the number of children with SEND who are being excluded from school as this term progresses?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, permanent exclusion should only ever be used as a last resort and must be lawful, reasonable and fair. And that is why we've already asked all schools to be understanding of all children and young people's needs, including those with special educational needs, especially when they return. And that this is exactly the point that I covered in my open letter to all children and their families with SEND last week. Off-rolling is never acceptable, and this will be monitored by Ofsted.
I'm sorry about this, but we're having to go to topicals with Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 1, please.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since last week, schools across the country have begun welcoming children back into the classroom with a range of protective measures in place. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of those teachers, support staff and the whole school community in making sure that it has been such a positive and pleasurable experience for all children as they return.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend update the House as to what support his department is giving to universities and schools to help them recruit foreign students?
Secretary of State.
Well, a great important strength of our university sector has always been its ability to attract students from right across the globe. We've been working with Universities UK and all universities to ensure that they're properly supported. We're supporting them in terms of a campaign to attract more students to come to the UK, but also working across government to ensure that students who are applying for visas are able to do so with ease. And the Home Office has been incredibly supportive in ensuring that those who want to come and study here, it has been a positive experience for them.
So, Secretary of State Kate.
Last month, the Prime Minister ordered parents back to work, and while it may not have occurred to the Prime Minister, I want to draw the Secretaries of State's attention very specifically to their need for wraparound care at the start and end of the school day, where parents tell me there remains a gaping hole. So can the Secretary of State set out very precisely for the House what specifically he is doing to ensure that working parents' need for wraparound care will be met?
Secretary of State.
Well, the Honourable Lady raises an important point, and the importance of having wraparound care with schools. We're working with all schools to ensure that that provision is provided for parents. We've issued guidance on that in terms of setting out how this can be done in a safe and cautious way that works for both those who work in schools, but also importantly for the children who benefit from this wraparound care, and also the parents who depend on it as well.
Heading to Rutland with Alicia Kearns. Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Devastatingly, the return of students at Uppingham Community College has been delayed due to a fire damaging greatly the school buildings just before they plan to open. Nearby Casterton College is also in desperate need of investment. As many students don't live in Rutland, funding doesn't automatically go to the local authority. So what funding is available to help both these schools?
Secretary of State.
I thank my honourable friend for raising this important case in her constituency. The Uppingham Community College is actually covered by risk protection arrangements, and I know officials in my department are working closely with them to see what is needed in order to ensure that there is provision. But I know that my honourable friend, Baroness Berridge, would be delighted to meet with her to discuss in more detail some of the particular issues that she faces within Rutland and how we can best support her, and most importantly, the provision of education in her constituency.
David Lind.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In Scotland, there is provision for the youngest children in year group to defer their school start, including those born premature, some of whom will have fallen into the wrong year group because of their early birth. Currently, there's less flexibility for that in England. So will the Secretary of State agree to meet with a delegation of us from the all-party parliamentary group on premature and sick babies to look at how we support those families going forward?
Secretary of State.
I'd be more than happy to meet with such a delegation. I know from my own experience of having a child who arrived prematurely, some of the challenges that can come about, and be very interested to listen and sort of see what more can be done to support in the future.
William Bragg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I pay full tribute to all of the schools in my constituency who reopened on time and in full? And as the Secretary of State will be no doubt aware, this is against a background of record investment, which of course came into play in April. But he will also know, I'm quite sure, Mr. Speaker, that this was mooted as tranche one of a two-tranche funding settlement. So can you give us a reassurance this afternoon that the further investment will be introduced on time in the next financial year?
Secretary of State.
Well, I know that my honourable friend was itching to get back into the classroom if there was a need for extra teaching support as a former teacher himself, and but he was ready, willing, and most certainly able to do so had the call come. My honourable friend will have probably seen that the schools in his constituency are seeing over a £47 million cash increase. This will be followed by the next financial year, which will see a substantial cash increase, and the third financial year where there'll be a substantial cash increase. Schools were one of the few, if only, areas that were able to get a 3-year deal, and I believe this will have a real impact in helping them plan for the future and deliver best education.
We'll have speed up.
I'm also a former teacher, so if the Secretary of State, while he's raising those issues, but can I just ask him, has he heard any reports from schools about them making face masks part of school uniform, and there being school uniform requirements about the type of face mask that's worn? And whilst it's acceptable to, sorry, Mr. Speaker, whilst it's acceptable to have nothing inappropriate, surely it's unacceptable to require it to be part of uniform for a safety measure like this.
Well, I thank you, the honourable gentleman, for his offer to sort of step into any sort of supply needs that schools may have. But he raises a very important point, and I'd be happy, if it's possible, for him to meet with Minister for School Standards, actually, if there's sort of particular details or concerns that he's got, so that we could sort of take that up. I'm not aware of the situation that he outlines, but I think it's important to keep an eye across all of this. We've been very clear in our guidance that we've issued to schools, and we need to ensure that that guidance is properly considered by all schools, but people don't develop it in ways that it shouldn't be developed.
Let's head to Dame Cheryl in Amersham. Dame Cheryl Gillam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the course of this pandemic, we've seen an increase in people experiencing poor mental health and anxiety. And the new report from SAGE has warned of the serious implications of worsening mental health amongst students if education continues to be disrupted and universities do not fully open. Can the Minister reassure students and their families that universities are safe to open on the basis of blended learning, and confirm that there are clear strategies and additional support in place to support the mental health of students when they return to university? This is most important to our young people embarking on their further education.
My right honourable friend raises the important point of young people's mental health and the benefits that they get from going back to school, college and university. This is why we've worked incredibly closely, not just with the school sectors, but also the university sector, to ensure that that return is done in a safe, cautious and sort of planned way. And I'd like to thank all the work in the higher education sector that has been done. But we do recognise that COVID has presented some quite challenging mental health problems on many young people as well as staff, and that's why we announced a £9 million fund to support additional enhanced mental health work to support those who work and those who benefit from being in the education sector, students included.
Heading to Lewisham with Vicky Foxcroft. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 2nd of July, I asked the Secretary of State if he would write to me to confirm what extra practical support was being provided to disabled pupils, such as laptops and other assistive technology. As of yet, I have not received a response. Can he please update the House now, or at least let me know when I might receive the promised letter?
Well, I'll certainly go back to the department and immediately check as to why you haven't received that letter. I can only apologise for it not arriving with you.
There'll be more.
Mr. Speaker, after speaking with many individuals across Keighley and Ilkley who have or are involved with people with dyslexia, dyspraxia or other special educational needs, the message is that while support provision is often good, it is often uneven across schools. So what additional support can my right honourable friend provide to ensure high quality provision across all schools in West Yorkshire and the rest of the country?
Well, we have funded NASEN on behalf of the whole School SEND consortium to work to equip teachers to deliver high-quality teaching across all types of special educational needs, and this support is available to all schools. We also funded targeted support focused on particular areas of concern flagged by Ofsted and the CQC. We're putting £730 million into high needs next year, coming on top of this £780 million of additional funding this year, and that means that high needs funding has increased by 24% in just 2 years.
Manjeet Singh Desi. Mr. Speaker, young people's futures cannot be put on hold because of Tory incompetence. With schools now returning, many parents in Slough, particularly those who have been shielding, those living in multi-generational households or have children with special educational needs and disabilities, remain concerned about sending their children back to school. Given the government has failed to put in place the necessary SEND support and hasn't provided enough reassurance for parents regarding safety, how does the Secretary of State intend to ensure that all children can get back to school safely?
Well, we do want all children to return to school and to return to school safely, including children with special educational needs and disability. We've given guidance to schools, and my honourable friend has written an open letter to parents of children with special educational needs about returning. Where there are families who have particular concerns about the safety of returning, the advice we give is for them to talk to the head teacher, who hopefully will be able to provide them with reassurance.
St Austell is the largest town in Cornwall and has some of the most deprived communities, and further education provision within the town is vital to our young people's life chances. Cornwall College is seeking to secure high-quality further education facilities within St Austell by redeveloping their St Austell campus. Will the Secretary of State commit to working with me and the college to bring forward this redevelopment as soon as possible?
Well, maybe in anticipation of the question, Cornwall College has already been a beneficiary of £1.4 million worth of extra money heading towards it as a result of our commitment to putting more money in terms of the capital build in further education. But I'll be delighted to meet with my honourable friend and the college to discuss their plans further for St Austell and to hear about how they want to transform educational outcomes for not just those in St Austell but more widely in Cornwall as well.
Thank you. The Prime Minister talked of a mutant algorithm. The Secretary of State disclaimed all knowledge of its decisions as if it was some kind of educational horoscope. So will he confirm for us today that he recognises that algorithms are neither biology nor astrology? They are complex data manipulation tools which do what they are told to do, which cannot predict the performance of individuals, and which require a robust regulatory framework before being used in the public or private sector?
I very much agree with the fact that there needs to be a sort of a robust regulatory framework around any use of algorithms, and algorithms are used every single year in terms of the management, in terms of the grade boundaries that youngsters are awarded at both GCSE and A-level, but that's always been the case and will always be the case.
I've written to my honourable friend the FE Minister about West Knox College and how ESFA restrictions are limiting the way that they can support progress in my community. Will the Secretary of State commit to working with the college and myself to make sure we can help them to find a way to navigate these barriers and to fulfil their potential, delivering the best possible FE for our community in Mansfield?
Well, it's been incredibly impressive to see the turnaround at West Nottinghamshire College and the work that's already been undertaken. And I'd be more than happy to work with my honourable friend to see what opportunities that can be created in the future for this college. It has had some difficult times, but is very much looking to the future with optimism and with a real sense of purpose of delivering the very best for young people in his constituency.
Heading up to Manchester to Afzal Khan. Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I hope the Secretary of State already knows, there are about 20,000 private or homeschool students who would normally have taken A-level, AS-level, and GCSE exams this summer. These students were excluded from the U-turn on the assessment algorithm last month and are therefore still being penalized by this government's arbitrary and discriminatory policies. Will the Secretary of State now agree to properly engage with this issue and meet with me to discuss how this situation can be rectified so that no young person is left behind?
Well, yes, I'm very happy to meet the honourable member. This was an issue that we discussed at great length with the regulator. We wanted to find a way in which they could be awarded grades, notwithstanding the fact that the summer series had to be cancelled. But because they didn't, for some students, though, who do not have a relationship with a school, it wasn't possible for them to have centre-assessed grades. And that is why, one of the reasons why we put on an autumn series of exams in all subjects across both GCSEs and A-levels and AS levels to ensure they had the opportunity to take their exams this year.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The return to school is particularly challenging for those young people who are hard of hearing. Will my right honourable friend congratulate Bungay High School, who have just opened a new specialist facility for students with hearing loss? And will he give an update for one of those students, Daniel Gillings, who he has met, both on the development of the BSL GCSE and an assurance that this will not be delayed?
Yes, I'm happy to join my honourable friend in congratulating Bungay High School on their new specialist facility, and I pay tribute to my honourable friend for his passion and his support for a GCSE in British Sign Language. I do remember meeting Daniel Gillings and his mother, who made a very compelling case. As this is a brand new subject at GCSE, we have been taking care to consult experts very closely on the detail of the subject content. Because of the COVID pandemic, this has affected the timeline for developing the GCSE, but my honourable friend will be pleased to know that that work has now been resumed.
in order to allow the safe exit of unruly members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next. I am suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. I call the Secretary of State, Grant Shapps, to make a statement for up to 10 minutes. Grant Shapps.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a statement about international travel corridors. In June, 14 days isolation was introduced for travellers arriving in the UK with a small number of workers' exemptions. This action has helped ensure sacrifices of our nationwide lockdown were not wasted, and it's played a part in keeping our infection rate lower than elsewhere. At the same time, we set up the Joint Biosecurity Centre and tasked it with pulling together intelligence in order to assess the risks of inbound travel from hundreds of territories. By July, the Joint Biosecurity Centre's analysis helped to inform our decisions to establish travel corridors, meaning that people could return to the UK from low-risk countries without quarantine. Of course, Mr. Speaker, we all know that this dreadful disease takes instructions from no one. Even with our increased understanding about the way that COVID preys upon and capitalises on close human contact, we can still be taken aback by its speed of transmission. Whether at home through the imposition of local lockdowns or abroad where a country suddenly sees infection rates take off. And I'm the first to admit that the unpredictable nature of the virus can take us all, holidaymakers included, by surprise. As I landed in Spain on my family holiday, I was immediately joining a ministerial call during which I helped to impose 14 days quarantine on Spain, thereby effectively terminating my break, but more importantly, sadly, disrupting the holidays of tens of thousands of Brits in Spain and elsewhere. And I know how distressing this has been. But I also know that those hard-won gains from the earlier days of this crisis must not, cannot, and will not be sacrificed. Ministers will continue to take proportionate action, informed by JBC analysis. Now, Mr. Speaker, during July and August, we didn't have the means to accurately assess risks within countries and within regions. The kind of comprehensive Office for National Statistics data that we now have through their testing was never available overseas, and it was too easy for the virus to migrate between regions without borders or boundaries. However, as JBC resources have strengthened, we've been able to collaborate much more closely with other governments and their health authorities. This has led to a more forensic picture. Now, for the first time, we're able to consider a granular approach to assessing detailed data abroad. And I've looked at whether this means we can implement regionalised systems for international travel corridors. But in many cases, the international data is still simply too patchy. And in all cases, there is next to nothing to prevent people from moving around within a country's border. I know that people will rightly point out that infection rates also vary across the United Kingdom, and indeed they do. But the difference is that the countries we're talking about all, by definition, have higher rates of infection than we do ourselves. So I hope the House understands that the JBC and this government are therefore at present unable to introduce regional travel corridors from within the geographical boundaries of a nation state. However, when a region has natural boundaries, like an island, for example, the risk diminishes significantly. And that presents us with a real opportunity. Our passenger locator form, combined with NHS Test and Trace, will give us a clear picture, and has started to give us a clear picture, of exactly where infections are coming from. And as a result, I can today announce a new islands policy. For the first time, we have the data and the capacity to add and remove specific islands from quarantine, while still providing maximum protection to the UK public. There are thousands of islands across the globe, far too many for JBC to monitor on a detailed level. But it may assist the House if I outline the 4 guiding principles which we intend to apply. First, this regionalised approach can only apply to land that has clear boundaries or border, in other words, an island. Second, the data collected must be robust, reliable, and internationally comparable. Third, the island must have direct flights from the UK, or at the very minimum, transport must be able to take place through quarantine-exempt territories. And fourth, the FCDO travel advice should align as far as practicable. The JBC methodology that I've just described for islands has been developed in consultation with the Chief Medical Officer and Public Health England. This new capability means that we'll now be able to nuance our decisions, first and foremost to safeguard the health of British citizens, but also to enable British tourists to enjoy trips to islands, even if the mainland is deemed too risky. However, it is worth noting that the policy will not necessarily open up additional islands immediately. For example, when we removed Spain from the travel corridor list, there were 24 cases per 100,000. Today, there are 127 cases, and it remains too high in the Balearic and Canary Islands as well. On the other hand, Greece remains within our travel corridor programme, but our new analysis shows that some of the islands are well outside of the parameters. Indeed, despite overall Greek infection levels being lower than ours, Scotland has already felt compelled to add the entirety of Greece, including the mainland, to the quarantine. However, using our newly acquired JBC data, we're now in a position to remove Greek islands where holidaymakers are at risk of spreading the new infection back home, and 7 Greek islands will therefore be removed from travel list at 4 a.m. on Wednesday, the 9th of September, whilst maintaining mainland Greece. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank our medical experts who have forged these professional relationships and improved capacity. However, I want to make one thing clear. During coronavirus, travelling during coronavirus is not without risk. So please, if you're travelling, go with your eyes open. And remember, breaching quarantine is not only an offence which can gain you a criminal record, but you are also putting the lives of your loved ones at risk and loved ones of those you've never met before at risk too. I know there's also considerable interest across the House on testing at borders to see if we can remove the necessity to self-isolate at all. It sounds completely logical, and yet, as the CMO reminds us, it simply will not capture most of those who are asymptomatically carrying coronavirus. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, those who are symptomatic should not be travelling in the first place. This point was brought home to me in a conversation with the head of one of Britain's major airport groups, who decided to trial airport testing for himself and a group of 8 returning holiday makers. They all tested negative. A week in quarantine, they took a further test, and one of their group was positive. This illustrates PHE's point that due to the incubation period of this disease, and even using highly accurate tests, the capture rate of those who are actually carrying COVID-19 may be as low as 7%, leaving 93% of people who are actually infected free to go about their business. More likely now, most likely under those circumstances, in the misguided belief that they don't carry coronavirus. However, quarantine combined with testing is more promising. So we are working actively on the practicalities of using testing to release people from quarantine earlier than 14 days. For the reasons described, this could not be a pure test on arrival option. It would not work. But my officials are working with health experts with the aim of cutting the quarantine period without adding to infection risk or infringing our overall NHS test capacity, which also now needs to cater to schools going back and universities returning. Mr. Speaker, the island's policy itself becomes active immediately, and I will of course update the House on quarantine testing in the coming weeks. And I commend this statement to the House.
Now come to the Shadow Secretary of State, Jim McMahon, with 5 minutes. Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Transport Secretary for prior sight of the statement, although I should say for the record that it did only actually arrive 5 minutes before this session was due to start, which I'm not sure is quite in the spirit, and it's worth taking that back to officials to make sure that doesn't happen again. But I should say the Transport Secretary did make the effort to give me a call today, and that is appreciated before this. Mr. Speaker, the government's response to the COVID-19 crisis has been nothing short of chaotic. Almost at every turn, it lacked a clear strategy, and this failure has been acutely felt in aviation. For months, even when the virus was at its peak, millions of passengers were coming from all over the world without any restrictions placed upon them at all. By the time restrictions were introduced, we were one of only a handful of countries in the world who up to that point had failed to take action on bringing restrictions in place. And it's this pattern where the government has been too slow to act, coupled with a blunt intervention to overcompensate for it, which has dogged the handling of the pandemic right from the outset. First, a blunt quarantine for all, bar France, but then France was back on. Then air corridors were on the table, then they weren't. And then what we really saw wasn't air corridors or air bridges or whatever name is given to them. We had a list, essentially a Foreign Office list that was produced where half of the countries on that list had restrictions on British travellers travelling to their country. No travel corridor, no air bridge at all. And now we're seeing countries coming and going off the list with very little notice to people who have made the decision to go on holiday and expended the cost of doing that. And it's all very well for the government now to change position and tell people that when travelling, they should go with their eyes open. It wasn't that long ago the government were defending a very senior member of Number 10 for driving for an eye test, let alone going with eyes full open. The British public are not stupid. They understand fully the pandemic and what it means to everyday life. But, you know, people work hard. and they're desperate to return back to a sense of normality. And that one holiday a year for many people is something they save up for, they look forward to, but they can't afford a 14-day quarantine to be put on them with very little notice. What we need to see is when this data was really made available. We all know across Europe there is localised and regional data made available. So why wasn't it reviewed when the decision was made in Spain, for instance, to have the restrictions on the islands? The point was made at the time, the government didn't move, but it strikes me the evidence base actually was in place, and so it makes sense to publish that evidence in the House of Commons library so it can be reviewed. We need to make sure that we don't take this blunt intervention all the time. It appears chaotic because it is chaotic. There won't be a single intervention in itself that will keep this country safe. It will be a number of interventions taken together that make us safe, and a key part of that is testing. And frankly, it is beyond belief that people arrive in this country from all over the world without any tests being carried out either at the airport or 5 days later. And it's important that we carry out now a full review, not just of quarantine in the very blunt sense that the government approaches it, but also in making sure that the proper test and tracking system is in place. I know in my own town, Mr. Speaker, the national contact tracing system has failed to get through to half of those they should have made contact with. So when you have that infrastructure and that performance so weak, it's little surprise that the government is constantly going from one crisis to another. Yes. Mr. Speaker, aviation is on its knees. The very limited nature of support offered by this government has meant job losses all over the place, in a sector that was always going to take longer to recover than other parts of the economy, and the government knew that. But even with the money that is given over to the airlines, where are the conditions to protect workers' rights? It's a scandal. You know, that hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money is being given out with no conditions to protect the workers at British Airways or EasyJet and the rights that they have built up. Labour's position is clear. We have set out a plan for a sectoral deal with 6 key conditions supporting jobs, tackling climate change and fair play on tax. And it's important the government now come forward with a proper sectoral deal. We'll absolutely work in partnership in the national interest, but the government cannot continue to go from one crisis to another, because at the end of the day, key to beating the virus is maintaining public support. And I've got to tell the Transport Secretary, we're in real danger of losing that support.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do apologise to the honourable gentleman for not getting the statement. I don't know why that happened, and I will certainly make inquiries, Mr. Speaker, and I did actually, as he mentioned, call in advance unrelated to the statement itself. Mr. Speaker, I have to say, this is not a virus that any of us control, beyond the way in which we all behave individually and the extent to which we all have contact that we perhaps shouldn't be having. It's very easy to come to the dispatch box and be a sort of professor of hindsight and sort of say, well, you should have done this and you shouldn't have done that. But actually, the facts of the case are, if he can tell me that 1 week Jamaica will be at a rate per 100,000 of 3% or 5%, and the next week breaching 3 or 5 per 100,000, the next week breaching 20, and somehow he can explain how he can find that out, even though the Joint Biosecurity Centre, Public Health England and all the other experts were unable to predict it, then I am the first to welcome that kind of detailed information and knowledge, because it does not exist, and no country in the world has combined as much information, I believe, as has been pulled together in order to work on a detailed island policy. In fact, it's difficult to think of another country in Europe who are doing more testing than the UK now, with testing capacity of 1/3 tests per day and going up to 500,000 today. I was speaking to my French opposite number, who told me that they would reach 400,000 tests a week. We are able to do that in a day and a half in this country. So it is as a result of our NHS test and trace system, combined with the passenger locator form, which has enabled us to get the very specific data extracted to know where infections are coming back from, and that's been extraordinarily useful. And as I reiterate, and I can't say it any clearer, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to say it again, In these times, when we travel, we must accept that we have to go with our eyes open. I gave that Jamaica example, but unfortunately the same exists everywhere else. And I'm not really sure what the Honourable Gentleman is suggesting. Should we not have travel corridors at all and prevent everybody from travelling? But that can't be the case, because he wants to support the aviation sector, he tells us. So in which case you must have some kind of corridors open, otherwise you're not supporting them. And that's why we have pumped an enormous amount of money via the British taxpayer into supporting the aviation sector. I can think off the top of my head, there are 56,400 members of staff using the furlough scheme, which would add up to well over £1 billion. There is a £1.8 billion fund, which is the Bank of England CCFF fund, which has supported aviation-specific companies. And of course, there have been all manner of other funds, including the CJRS fund, 283 million from that, which has gone to the aviation sector. And of course, we want the sector to be going again. As I mentioned towards the end of my speech, and I will return to the House on this, testing is a part of that. But I also explained the complexity of testing on day zero. And I didn't hear whether that is what the opposition front bench is calling for, but there are significant issues with testing on day zero in a manner which won't necessarily, as described, find those who are carrying the virus, but actually convince lots of people that they're not, and that is not the answer as well. So we are working on all of those things, and I do encourage the Honourable Gentleman to work with us rather than score points from us when everybody is trying to do the right thing nationwide to beat this virus.
Select Committee, you, Merriman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I welcome the decision by the Secretary of State to look at islands separately to certain mainland territories. Can I also ask him to give perhaps a little more detail on where his thought process is with regards to testing? He is absolutely right that this has to be all about proportionality. On the one hand, there are many in this country who have foregone their holiday abroad, and it's right that they are not given more risk to getting the virus themselves from those who have gone abroad. Equally, it may well be that there is the testing capability, not at day one, which we know does not work with any reliability, but perhaps a certain number of days afterwards, which could allow quarantine to be ended and the aviation industry to get much needed support. So can I therefore ask him, on the scale of the 0 to 14 days, is he looking at around about the day 8 period where there will be that proportionality on safety? And he mentioned the coming weeks as to when the House would know more. Could I push him a little more to be specific as to when the House is likely to see a different approach come in?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to the Chair of the Select Committee for his boundless work during this crisis in following up on all manner of aviation in particular, but other transport issues. And he's absolutely right that testing in all its senses is a large part of the solution to everything related, or at least everything related to coronavirus. It's extremely important that we get it right. We know that there's pressure on the testing system. We know that schools are going back and entire classes, entire years require testing, universities the same, and Dido spoke about this last week, and it means that I do think we need to make sure that we're prioritising that. On the other hand, we know that it can be helpful for returning holiday makers and other people travelling as well. Day zero doesn't work at the airport, we know, but it can work, testing later. That capacity is something which will be an issue for the reasons of the NHS test and trace I mentioned. And I can reassure my honourable friend, and indeed the House, that I'll return to the House with proposals which are currently being worked on with the industry for something which is both practical and workable, and that people could rely on as much as the NHS test and trace system itself.
Now come to the SMT spokesperson, Gavin Newlands, with 2 minutes.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, which we also received a minute after he was due to deliver it. But we can see from all of the recent data that coronavirus is currently spreading far more rapidly throughout the UK and many parts of Europe than in recent months. As a result, the red list of countries from which travellers must quarantine on the return has been increasing steadily in recent weeks. Often, the UK's 4 governments have come to the same conclusions on quarantine decisions at the same time. However, Scotland and Wales have occasionally made different decisions, as is their devolved right. Portugal was recently placed on the red list for Scotland and Wales, as it is now experiencing 23.2 cases per 100,000, But the Secretary of State accused the Scottish Government of creating confusion by placing Portugal on the quarantine list and of jumping the gun on Greece. Indeed, he's doubled down on this in his statement today. The Scottish and Welsh First Ministers haven't criticised him or his government for their decisions on quarantine, so these are very unfortunate remarks for which the Secretary of State should reflect on and perhaps apologise. The resurgence of coronavirus has shown that the trouble for the airline and tourism industries will persist for quite some time. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, what further support for the airline industry specifically can the Minister commit to? And will he actually keep his promise to the industry of specific support? And if there is a second wave of coronavirus that decimates international travel once again, the industry could be back to square one of the pandemic. Does he agree that this makes a strong case for the argument that targeted extensions of the furlough scheme are necessary? And further to the point that the Chair of the Select Committee made, can I push him on the timeline for this aviation traveller quarantine testing programme? When will he bring that back to the House by? And finally, Mr Speaker, nobody travels more internationally than cabin crew and pilots. Recent weeks have seen many loyal British Airways cabin crew out of a job having refused to be fired and then rehired on slashed wages. Will the Secretary of State apologise to those workers for failing to protect them?
Hear, hear. Well, Mr Speaker, actually, once again on the statement issue, I will certainly be investigating it. I'm very intolerant of things being dispatched late from my office, and I'll write to you, Mr Speaker, to let you know, as well as the members concerned, what happened. I know that the Honourable Gentleman shares my passion for aviation, and I did want to just answer his points. I think also, though, it's important to mention to him not to believe everything you simply read in the newspapers. I know this will come as a shock to right honourable members across the House, but it's not always accurately reported. I did not criticise Scotland. I simply used the example to explain that they were unable to have the granular data and had to remove the whole of Greece as a result. And on Portugal, as you may have heard me say, although the incident rate was higher, the percentage of positive tests had reduced, which is why we came to different decisions, and that's within our right to do. I've spoken to my opposite number in Scotland today, and I've explained that we'll be further sharing the data in order to make granular decisions on islands if that's what the Scottish Government wishes to do. I do want to stress our support for not just airlines, but the whole of the aviation sector. And it is interesting, as I suggested, when you add this up, it comes into the billions of pounds, but is frequently mischaracterised as somehow being a lack of support. Well, billions of pounds is not a lack of support. This is taxpayers' money that we're giving to commercial organisations in order to try to keep them going. And on his point about testing, I absolutely will return to the House. I have to say to the Honourable Gentleman and others, we have to have the science behind us to do this. It's the same with the travel corridors, with the island approach. We cannot return here until there is a test, for example, which will work under the circumstances described. And so far, as far as I'm aware, Porton Down hasn't approved any of those private tests that you read about every weekend in the newspaper saying, it's solved, we can just do this. And so I can only work to the speed of the scientists, but I certainly will not delay it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. International visitors spend around half of the £10 billion generated in the West End alone, in the heart of my constituency of the cities of London and Westminster. Mr. Speaker, would the my right honourable friend give us assurances that he will continue to monitor and to consider taking more countries off the red list as and when it is safe to do so, in order for us to be able to welcome more overseas visitors back to our shores as soon as possible?
My honourable friend's absolutely right, and very concerned about, of course, not just the city, but cities and towns across this country who should be enjoying a far greater number of tourists and visitors and business people than they are. And I will certainly do exactly what she asked. It is a fact that at the moment, numbers, particularly from European destinations, are, I'm afraid, on the rise, and that has led to countries coming off. But most weeks we do add a territory or two as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the scale of the challenges faced by the aviation sector and the scale of job losses, Today's announcement does seem to fall woefully short of the integrated government leadership that we need to get planes flying and passengers having the confidence to travel safely. And indeed, many employers locally to Feltham and Heston have raised with me that they haven't felt the government is really listening to the challenges that they are facing. Airports have been working on testing and increased testing in pilots for months. And they don't feel the government has really listened to them either. So could he perhaps update the House as to when he plans to come back about on the issue of increased testing to be able to reduce quarantine times? And could he also say whether he will be coming back to the House to look at when he can increase the extent of the announcement he's made today? For example, to look at a pilot or trial to fly from Heathrow to JFK, with New York now having lower COVID rates than other parts of the US.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I speak very regularly, including, I think, at least twice over the weekend, to the boss of Heathrow Airport, John Holland Kay, and also businesses in her constituency and all honourable members' constituencies who are concerned about aviation and the issues that have been created. Of course, the simple fact of the matter is that, as I mentioned before, until we have tests which are reliable enough and signed off through the PHE and Porton Down process, it's not possible to simply jump the gun as far as those things are concerned. But I am very, very actively working with the airports, and as I say, it's been a bit of a challenge to convince people that it sounds so simple and obvious that you just take a test day zero when you land, a bit like you can point a temperature checker at someone's head, and then you have to work through the reasons why that actually is not going to protect us from coronavirus. It's about doing the right things as well as doing those things quickly, but she absolutely has my assurance. I'm on it day and night, and we will continue to be until we get solutions.
Because
Stockton South, we've seen a small rise in the number of confirmed COVID cases. Can my right honourable friend assure us that he will continue to keep the travel corridor list under constant and scrupulous review, allowing people to travel where it is safe to do so, but importantly ensuring we act to control the virus?
Right on, my honourable friend's absolutely right. Without fear or favour is the answer, yes.
Speaker, Liverpool Airport in my constituency is already losing 15% of jobs in operations at the airport, jobs in air traffic control, ground handling, security, and in the airlines operating from there, such as EasyJet, because passenger numbers are about 65% down on where they would normally be. Even worse, jobs carnage will result if furlough is ended without a sector-specific deal for aviation. Now, if he's focusing on testing to release people earlier from quarantine, because there's going to be an ongoing imposition and lifting of blanket 14-day quarantines, whether or not the islands are included, can he undertake to make sure that there's support, like furlough, in place for the airports and airlines and the aviation industry until those arrangements are put in place?
I can assure the honourable lady that, I mean, we work very, very hard and have done with this package, which is nothing that this country has ever seen before in terms of size and scale and impact. It has saved literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs in this country. But as the Chancellor has said, we have to also balance that with making sure there are jobs to go back to. And I do respect what you said with airports like John Lennon and her constituency really struggling. I've spoken only earlier today to the boss of EasyJet, who's one of the main carriers there. They're desperate to get back in the air. We can't detach policy from the reality. And the reality that this virus is very real, and nobody has a simple solution to deal with it until we get a vaccine. But I can assure her I'll be working very hard with Liverpool Airport, with the carriers that come in and out of there, and with the Chancellor, who will be speaking more from this dispatch box in an autumn statement, to do everything we possibly can.
Dr. Andrew Morrison. Not here. Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's announcement about the islands policy. It seems like a pragmatic, sensible thing to do. However, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people right now who are about to go away tonight or tomorrow who must be thinking, what will happen when they return from their trip? My point is actually about the testing regime and the possibility of actually introducing something far more robust at airports. But also, if there is such great capacity available in the system, as the Secretary of State was suggesting, why is there not a mandatory test when everyone returns 7 days after?
I actually just want to clarify about the amount of testing in the system. We do have 1/3 tests today. We're taking it up to 500,000 by the end of October. But members will also be aware, and this has been discussed in the last few days, that schools have gone back, universities have gone back. Pressure on testing is very real at this particular moment in time. And I am not sure that we should be prioritising, holidaymakers returning to testing system over, for example, children going back to school. And it's, the simple solution is, of course, to create more testing, and that is something which I absolutely want to see happen. But I think that will need to come through the private sector route, and that means that those tests will need to be approved and signed off on a scientific basis. And as soon as that's done, and we can prove the whole thing will stack up, then we'll be in business.
We now head to Blackpool South with Scott Benton. Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The £160 billion worth of support which your government has made available to businesses has helped many firms within the travel industry and will ensure that jobs are protected for the time being. However, many of these firms now face an extremely difficult winter period. Will my right honourable friend commit to working with the Treasury to look at different ways in which businesses within this sector, such as Highfield Travel in my own constituency, can receive additional support?
I could tell my honourable friend I most certainly will, and the only thing I take issue with actually is the amount of money is a lot bigger, 283 million, and that's just on the CJ RS scheme. On the smaller loan schemes, a lot of those businesses, the travel companies, will have been taking advantage of that. And then on the smaller level, again, things like the bounce back loan, and that's before we get to the very, very large scale CCFF scheme, 1.6 billion, and the furlough. So there's been an awful lot of different projects that put money into businesses in his constituency and elsewhere, and he absolutely has my assurance that will continue.
Covered all with Stuart C. MacDonald. Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Two constituents have approached me who, like the Secretary of State, were already in Spain when that country was added to the quarantine list. Their employer chose not to pay this couple statutory sick pay, and he isn't required to, and that is causing them considerable hardship. Isn't that unfair, and doesn't that lack of sick pay make it less likely that people will comply with quarantine?
But as I have mentioned before, no one feels this more acutely than me, having put myself effectively into quarantine with that decision. Travel is something which we all must do with a degree of eyes open, accepting the risk at this time. And as I mentioned again from this dispatch box, people will need to think carefully when they travel as to whether, if a country does suddenly end up in quarantine, and I explain with some of the examples, like Jamaica, it can happen very quickly, that they are able to quarantine afterwards. Otherwise, it might be best not to travel, and that's a judgment that everybody will make. I think the honourable gentleman knows that the Chancellor and my honourable friend for the Department of Work and Pensions have also made some significant moves in order to assist, particularly where people are in local lockdown areas.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure my right honourable friend's been contacted by dozens of his constituents, as have we all, as to whether one country or another is about to be added to the quarantine list. With that in mind, I wonder whether my right honourable friend might share his department's thinking as to whether some of the joint biosecurity centres data might be opened up to inform those decisions by our constituents.
My honourable friend's absolutely right, and my answer when people ask me, is such and such a country going to be added, I usually say, I don't know why you're asking me. I couldn't get it right in Spain, and I went there myself, so I'm probably not the best guide, because this virus just moves in ways that are difficult to predict. But I do agree with him that the more information available, the better. And you may have seen that I have spent some time publicising and tweeting the various different measures that the JBC use in order to assess the risk from each country, which goes way beyond the cases per 100,000 over 7 days.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate what the Minister said about the need for people to have holidays, and also my own constituency in Edinburgh West. We appreciate the value of the aviation industry at the moment. Edinburgh Airport's already had to confirm that around 1/3 of its staff is to be made redundant. So can the Minister ensure us that the government will take every opportunity to balance the need to shorten quarantine to support the aviation industry with following the medical evidence about what is best?
I absolutely can. I've spoken to the boss of Edinburgh Airport during this crisis, and I know how difficult it is to run those businesses when you don't know what's going to happen next. Quarantine, of course, is a devolved matter for Scotland, so those decisions and discussions I know are ongoing between the Scottish Government and Edinburgh Airport, but she has my assurance that it's certainly front of my mind.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will know that 900 Harlow residents are employed at Stansted Airport, both directly and indirectly. However, already we've seen many job losses by ABM, Blue Handling and EasyJet, who've also closed their Stansted Airport base. So will my right honourable friend ensure that the measures that your department is taking will protect the jobs of my constituents?
Well, I know my honourable friend fights very hard for his constituencies. I spoke to the boss of Stansted, Charlie Cornish, earlier today, and we discussed the measures that we've been taking and our hopes for the way that the policies can develop. And I can tell you that one of the things he said would be, I think, helpful in this regard is certainly the islands policy being announced today, which will help to protect jobs, because in time it will enable islands to be added when the mainland would not have been flyable to, and I very much hope that assists.
Secretary of State suggested 3 days ago that differences in quarantine rules between the UK nations led to confusion. The UK government has had over 20 years to get used to the fact that health has devolved in Wales. Could he therefore clarify that any confusion between the rules of England and Wales arises consistently from a failure on the part of his government to communicate when its rules apply to England only?
No, Mr. Speaker, that's actually factually incorrect. I speak to my counterparts from the other three parts of our nations every single week on various different occasions. Each of us at different times have had cause to say to the other, I'm sorry that we couldn't have done this without you. And I have to say, that's happened from both the Welsh and the Scottish governments at various times. So it's simply untrue. I do try to share the data. I think it's helpful for travellers if we can move in unison. It isn't always possible. And although she points out there's been 20 years of devolution, it has never meant that the sort of decisions over things like quarantine in any past situation that I can think of. So this has found new territory for devolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents in Newcastle-under-Lyme were very grateful to get away this summer after the introduction of travel corridors. I know it hasn't been easy for everybody all the time with the decisions that had to be made, and he knows that better than anybody, but everyone who did make that choice, and it was a choice, went into it with their eyes open, as he said. They and I today would welcome what you said about islands and further granularity. I hope we can get more granularity going forwards. But in the meantime, can he assure me that the list of both countries and islands will be kept under constant review so that we can get to more destinations as soon as it's safe to do so?
My honourable friend's absolutely right, and others have mentioned it as well. I know that everyone's constituents will be in contact to ask whether certain places will be able to be added. I'm always very happy to ask JBC to look at particular countries, and I do regularly do that on behalf of members from across the House, and they will put some extra time into studying those countries. They, of course, are already looking at the entirety of the world on a week-by-week basis, and he has my assurance that will continue.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many honourable members, I've had frequent contact from bemused constituents who can't understand why they see on their television day after day pictures of thousands of people streaming in through our airports with neither testing at the airport, which the Secretary of State said wouldn't be effective, or testing a number of days later, which the Secretary of State has conceded would be effective, or indeed without seemingly tracing where those people are going and who they are meeting. Now, for hundreds of thousands of those journeys, it's too late, and if those people were bringing coronavirus into this country, that has now happened. But we are responsible for what happens from today. So, Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Secretary of State would give clear assurance that for every single person arriving at a UK airport, we know where they're coming from, we know where they're going, we know whether they quarantine, we know whether they had the coronavirus or not, and if so, we know who they met. Because if not, all the talk today is moot.
Well, the passenger locator form has been introduced. It was a new innovation. It had to be brought in at great speed during this crisis, but it is now ensuring that we know where passengers are coming from. Where people don't fill it in, that is an offence, and people can be fined and are being fined, where people don't quarantine. I just want to make this very clear for the benefit of everybody in the House. That is a criminal offence. If you don't quarantine for 14 days and you take this virus and you spread it around, you are endangering the people that you love and others that you never even met, and you can get a criminal record for it. And to answer his question directly, we will be stepping up enforcement on it. In particular, I know that phone calls are made to 1 in 5 people. My wife actually separately got a phone call. Text messages will be being sent, and people should be aware that enforcement will be increasingly stepped up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank my right honourable friend for today's statement and for being the strong voice for aviation that I know he is. No one wants to see a second spike, least of all one that arises from cases from overseas. But would my right honourable friend assure me that he will continue to explore with an open mind any opportunity, including testing, that will allow the aviation industry to return to the skies and get on with its vital role of unleashing much-needed economic growth?
Well, the friend's absolutely right. I mean, I'm a great champion, as he is, of the aviation sector, and it breaks my heart to see it suffering, to see the jobs that are being impacted on, and the second or third greatest, biggest aviation sector in the world, economy in the world, being affected. So he's absolutely right to ask, will I keep my eyes and ears open for absolutely everything that we can do? I have my officials working on this all of the time, and I will return, a number of members have asked when, I will return to this House the moment that the scientists provide the information that we need in order to be able to take further testing forward.
Mr. Speaker, and finally the Secretary of State in his last answer actually acknowledged that we have a major aviation sector which is hugely important to Britain and Britain's place in the world. No acknowledgement of that in his statement, nor any acknowledgement of the 10,000 jobs that have already gone and the 100,000 jobs that are at risk. And also, the Secretary of State, quite frankly, seems to be focusing on seeking complete risk avoidance rather than intelligent risk management. He needs to recognise unemployment kills, poverty kills as well. And we need to be getting Britain back to work as we go into the autumn when we're facing a national jobs crisis and particularly a crisis in the aviation industry. When's he going to get a move on?
Mr. Speaker, I may have taken there's a rather presumptuous position of thinking that the House knew how much I love aviation, and I'll put it on record again as a qualified pilot for 25 years. I absolutely think that it is a terrific industry. But he's right about the balance between getting people back to work, and he knows how hard we're working to persuade people to go back, but to do it in a safe way. And I do slightly take issue with him at the idea he talks about the risk and benefit ratio. It is very important that we don't see another spike, and we are seeing numbers creeping up, and I think it would be unforgivable if we re-imported, having got on top of this virus, the disease back in again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Iceland has a system whereby arrivals are tested at the airport and then 5 or 6 days later. Could that be viable in the UK?
I think the Iceland example is very interesting. I've seen in some other countries where they've been doing day zero testing, and will privately, in conversation with me, can see that it doesn't actually provide the answers that they require. A test later, whether that's 5 days, 7 days, 8 days, to be calculated by the scientists, I think is a much more possible and probable solution. I gave that example earlier of what happened when one of the airport bosses had his group tested a week later, and he found somebody who already had the virus and wasn't picked up at the beginning. So I think she's absolutely on something.
Let's head up to York to Rachel Maskell. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The University of York is going to extraordinary lengths to support international students arriving in the UK, from picking them up at airports to isolating them for 2 weeks at the university before teaching begins. However, this process could be significantly improved if a clear testing and tracing regime and testing infrastructure were put in place. The Secretary of State has said that there are capacity issues, but why hasn't he properly planned for this? Having known the arrival programme of international students, it appears that he is shifting the responsibility to universities to manage this situation rather than sorting it out himself.
Well, Mr. Speaker, no, I don't accept that, because actually students come from lots of different places, some of whom will be in travel corridors and don't need to self-isolate. Others will require self-isolation, but in the context of being here for perhaps a year, 2, 3 years, this, I hope, will be a manageable situation for them. And again, let's not pretend this is all just straightforward, that somehow we can magic tests which are signed off and work. And I remind the House again, there are no tests, these private tests that have been referred to many times, that are currently signed off as being usable, and we have to be led by the medicine first.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my Colne Valley constituents work in the aviation and travel industries, with both Manchester Airport and Leeds Bradford Airport within an hour's travelling time. With that in mind, will the Secretary of State continue to do everything he can to introduce this testing regime that will not only help support the aviation and travel industries, but also help give certainty to holidaymakers and business travellers alike?
Quite simply, yes, I will.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been incredibly heartening during this pandemic how our communities have come together, they've done the right thing, they've followed the rules, and it's great to see. But during this quite chaotic conversation around tourism and tourists coming back from Leeds Bradford and Manchester Airport, I have constituents now contacting me on email and by telephone concerned that their neighbours aren't doing the right thing. So is the Minister aware of this? What is the Minister going to put in place to protect those people, particularly in constituencies like Batley and Spen, where in Batley we have enhanced restrictions? What is the Minister going to do to reassure constituents like mine?
Yes, I agree with the Honourable Lady. It's not only wrong and frustrating, it's also illegal for people to do that, come back and break the quarantine. So we absolutely will be stepping up measures, and I'm working with my Right Honourable friend, the Home Secretary, and others to secure that. And I again will say more about it very soon. And in the meantime, I send the message out clearly from this dispatch box: when you break your quarantine, you're breaking the law and you're putting yourself in line for a criminal record. And it's not something that anyone should want to do.
Andrew Sullivan. The travel corridor policy, whilst clearly very upsetting for those affected who've worked very hard for a holiday, is absolutely the right thing to do to keep us all safe. Could I ask the Secretary of State to consider one change, though, which would be to move the time, the weekly time for coming back, from 4 a.m. on a Saturday to midnight on a Sunday? Changeover for most people is on a Saturday or a Sunday, so most people could complete their week's holiday without having to buy expensive flights, which they don't have the money for, and ruin their holiday. Would he at least just consider that?
Yes, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. It's true that changeovers do indeed often take place on Saturday, and it might help if I just explain the sort of tensions that have to be measured off. The medical community would, of course, say don't leave any time at all, do it immediately. In fact, that's virtually what happened with Spain, the very first country to be removed from a corridor. Then, of course, the other view is allow it to continue, and it is a question of finding the best balance between the two that will satisfy both the Chief Medical Officer and his concerns, as well as try to get people home. So I can promise to undertake to continue to look at this, but I hope he understands and the House will appreciate the natural and proper tensions that are in place here.
Kat Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents want to make informed decisions about their travel arrangements. So will the Minister consider publishing the evidence and criteria by which countries are deemed to be on or off the quarantine list?
Yes, and in fact I think I can help the Honourable Lady, because actually I've already several times published the basis for the decision-making process, and the easiest way to find it is actually on my Twitter feed at Grant Shapps, and it explains the measures that are put into place. All the data is then available. The data is then available for somebody to look at, but we have been quite clear about where you need to go to see exactly which measures are taken into account.
26 withdrawn. Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When is the government going to give the financial support package to the aviation sector, as the Chancellor promised in March, so that we can ensure the protection of worker rights, particularly those workers at BA and EasyJet?
As I mentioned in some previous answers, the billions of pounds have gone into support for the sector, and even once all of those schemes have been exhausted, there's also a programme that's run specifically by the Treasury which enables bespoke support to the industry. And I can't go into details because those are confidential arrangements, but those do exist and is already in existence.
David Green.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask my right honourable friend for a second to address international rail travel? He will know that Eurostar services from Ashford and Ebbsfleet have been suspended until 2022. Can he assure me that it remains the government's intention that those services should be resumed as soon as possible, and that the government recognises the importance of the Kent international rail services?
Absolutely, I can assure my right honourable friend we're very, concerned to see those stations closing and the lack of activity. And of course, as with our discussions about airlines, this is entirely driven by the progress, unfortunately, of the virus. So we will continue to take it keep it under review and work very closely with HS1 and that line to get them reopened as soon as possible.
Heading to Linlithgow with Martin Day. Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has ruled out testing at airports, claiming they give a false sense of security. Does the Minister agree with the Prime Minister about airport testing, or is this likely to be revisited when he updates the House on quarantine testing?
Well, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the example from an airport boss relayed to me this morning, where a day 0 test actually failed to pick somebody up, but a day 7 or 8 test was able to do that, I think shows why a single test on arrival is not the solution, much as it's not the solution to temperature test somebody on arrival to see if they've got coronavirus. So we need to be more sophisticated than that, and we absolutely will be. And I remind the honourable gentleman that different parts of the devolved administrations will need to come to their own decisions on it as well.
Heading up to our own, with Bob Blackman to land this question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I agree completely with my right honourable friend on the need for testing to improve and to increase. And so, given that in most international travel, someone arrives at the airport sometimes many hours before travelling, will he give a consideration as the science moves forward to enabling testing to take place before people get on aircraft, so that if they are showing signs of symptoms or they actually have the virus, they're not allowed to travel at all and not allowed to infect people on the plane that they're travelling on?
A sort of pre-quarantine is something that other countries are using. My French counterpart is using a 72-hour test before people arrive in France, for example. Again, you need to be certain that somebody has quarantined during that period and be cognizant of the incubation period, which can be up to 14 days with coronavirus. So it's not an entirely straightforward solution, but I do think it is worth additional examination. And again, I look to the scientists to help advise on this, and they're being very forthcoming with that advice.
Heading to Brentford with Ruth Cadbury. Ruth Cadbury. Mute. Press the button. Sound.
Sorry, sometimes that's done automatically for us, so my apologies. So Heathrow Airport has a large testing facility that's sitting idle. The UK economy is losing an estimated £60 million a day in tourism revenue, and constituencies near airports like mine are in economic crisis due to COVID. Now, in other equivalent countries like Germany with lower infection rates, if they can provide targeted support for their aviation sector, in our case, such as furlough extension, and they can also provide quick turnaround tests, and tests are getting more accurate all the time. Why can't the UK do this too?
Well, I'm not sure whether the Honourable Lady heard my previous comments about zero-day testing, but Germany was one of the countries that I know have been carrying out some tests at the border, along with France, Iceland and others. And some of these countries have been finding that in terms of detecting the disease, that on-the-day test is not the solution that we want it to be. So, as I said earlier, we're following the science and allowing the scientists, including Porter Down, to have a look at these various tests and then be able to provide advice as to what would be a safe time, and I'm working closely with the industry to try to get that in place.
Sir Robert Sims.
Can I welcome the statement and the pragmatic way the Secretary of State is proceeding? My view is the 14-day quarantine is a bit of a blunt instrument, and I'm doubtful about whether everybody does it. And I actually think if we move to a 7-day double test system, it will both make people safer, but could also encourage more travel. So we get a double advantage from doing that. So I welcome what he said, and all speed to him, please.
Well, I appreciate the comments. The only thing I would disagree with is I think the first test is not required and will lead people, if they're negative, to think that they maybe don't need to quarantine. It would be the test which helps to shorten that would be the important one.
Heading to Motherwell with Marion Fellows. Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How concerned is the Minister about other countries placing quarantine restrictions on the UK because of the rising tide of coronavirus infection here?
Well, I think the rises here and elsewhere are concerns for everybody, and we've seen, for example, with France, where their case numbers went up, and so far there hasn't been quarantine in return. But of course it remains a live issue, and it is something in this country that we can all do something about by following the rules and reminding others as well that this virus has not gone away, and to make sure that we're not spreading it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just in recent days, Bolton has seen the highest infection rate in the country, today standing at 115.8 per 100,000, with local media associating the dramatic spike in cases to a British holidaymaker who went on a pub crawl after returning from Spain. Will he join me in calling on everyone to do the right thing by staying home for the full quarantine period, if mandated, after returning from abroad?
Yes, absolutely. And how irresponsible is it to bring disease back and then spread it around communities and put people's lives at risk, as well as being at risk of getting a criminal record? And I'll absolutely join him in that call.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can the City of State for Transport outline what discussions and information SHARE has made available with the Northern Ireland Executive to align as closely as possible international travel advice while still accepting respected devolved authority? Ever mindful of the people from Northern Ireland travel from Belfast directly, use Glasgow, Manchester, Heathrow, Gatwick, and even Dublin Airport, International Airport, as connections to further afield. So does the City of State not believe that there's a case for mandatory alignment to keep all regions safe?
Well, as discussed earlier, there has been a devolution settlement which for 20 years hasn't been subject to these type of questions, which are usually to do with reserved powers. They are what they are, and I can tell him that I'm in very close contact with my opposite numbers in Northern Ireland, including as recently as today, and we continue to try to coordinate across our union as much as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As international travel slowly but surely gets back on its feet over the coming weeks and months, will the Secretary of State look at what further support he can give to help the many, many jobs dependent on the travel industry, such as through airport slots for airlines?
My honourable friend raises the interesting question of the 80-20 rule, I think he's referring to there, which at the moment is a European competence, but of course from January the 1st will be entirely a matter for the United Kingdom, and I can tell him I'd be considering it very carefully indeed to help the entire sector.
Everybody briefly now, Dr. Rupert.
Mr. Speaker, this in-out hokey-cokey of on or fair British quarantine comes after without interruption. Passengers have landed at Heathrow, straight onto the Piccadilly line, through Ealing and Acton, which is now a petri dish. We've got an above-average rate. So can he please stop playing politics and give TfL the bailout that they deserve at a time of national crisis to save the whole of London and my constituents from that second spike?
I certainly congratulate the Honourable Lady for shoehorning TfL into all of this. I know that we'll be having further conversations, but I think if memory serves me right, I've already bailed them out to the tune of £1.6 billion.
Dr. James Davis.
Travel corridors are a necessary, albeit blunt, instrument to control COVID levels in this country, and I welcome his further announcements today. But will he agree with me that differing rules across different parts of the UK are confusing and awkward, both for passengers as well as for tourist industries?
Well, I do accept that it adds to some confusion for people, and nonetheless, we respect the settlement that is in place. I think it is, though, important that we work as four nations as closely as possible together, and I will continue to look for opportunities and ways to do that, including through a lot of information sharing to enable us, I hope, to come to decisions that confuse people a bit less.
Brennan.
I'm surprised the member for the Vale of Clwyd didn't welcome the fact that the Transport Secretary is following what was done in Wales in relation to having an islands policy. And I think it's good that devolution is helping each different administration to learn. Can we, though, have a look, as the Honourable, his friend said, for South West Bedfordshire, at this issue of announcing at 4 a.m. on a Thursday, rather than at a time when people can have their travel arrangements in place?
Yeah, so the usual pattern is afternoon on Thursday, and then with it coming in at 4 a.m. as he says, and I do understand the point about the changeover date, as I mentioned before, which has to be measured against, if you know that there's a problem, is it right to wait and allow that problem to develop? And it is a judgment call, and I'm not going to pretend anything otherwise, and as I said to my honourable friend, I will certainly be reflecting on it further.
Final question, Gareth Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, thousands of international travellers used to come into this country via HS1 before this virus hit. Now HS1, of course, is in a perilous position with both Ebbsfleet and Ashford stations closed until at least 2020. Given the department's commitment to high-speed rail, would the Secretary of State or one of his team care to meet with both HS1, Eurostar and myself to try and resolve this serious situation?
Those stations are closed to 2021, and I'd be very happy with the Rail Minister to have that meeting. It's extremely concerning. And again, it's just another sign of how all-encompassing this fight against this virus, which is just not over yet, is. I will make sure that meeting is set up.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next item, suspend the House for 3 minutes. Order.